Hello, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. This is part 4 of Between Babel and Pentecost, a Christian analysis of multiculturalism. We have talked about Babel, and we have just finished talking about Pentecost. Links to those are in the descriptions below. So now, it is time to dive into multiculturalism. And this is where we start adding politics to the theological discussion. Because as we talked about last time, the church is multicultural, but we in the West also have an extremely popular socio-political ideology called multiculturalism. And this ideology promotes the existence of multiple cultures all within a single jurisdiction. And that does describe the church. One holy Christian apostolic church, one kingdom of God, which encompasses people of every tribe and nation. But when we speak of the contemporary political ideology of multiculturalism, we're talking politics. We're talking temporal government, left-hand kingdom stuff, not church stuff. And politically speaking, multiculturalism is the latest answer to the question of how are we all supposed to get along now that Enlightenment scientific rationalism has failed in this regard. It did not unite the world. It just ushered in a new era of truly horrific warfare. And we talked about that in part 2. In World War II, it not only saw the end of that whole war to end all wars naivete, but it also saw the rise of several ultra-nationalist states, namely Germany and Japan. And they launched an extremely violent and destructive war that ended up being marked by genocide, these attempts to eradicate other tribes and other nations altogether. So the visceral motivation behind multiculturalism is an attempt to stop anything like that from ever happening again, which is a good goal. That's great. We might be stuck in a fallen world, but maybe deliberately attempting to avoid genocide is still something that we can manage, at least to some extent. Low-hanging fruit at the very least. But the methodology behind multiculturalism is another thing altogether. How can different cultures avoid conflict when they're pushed together into the same jurisdiction? And according to multiculturalism, we avoid conflict by uncritically embracing one another, by either discarding our national or tribal differences, or acting as though those differences make no difference, that they are completely arbitrary, that they're irrelevant, that they are nothing worth fighting about. And so there are two key ideas within multiculturalism that facilitate this whole idea of getting along, this whole hope for peace between different peoples. First of these is cultural relativism. And it's essentially the proposition that one culture has absolutely no business judging another culture in any way as being right or wrong or good or bad. You can't compare one culture to another and say that, one is better. You can't make any distinction between a civilized culture and a barbaric culture. No such distinction. And you can't do this regarding the culture as a whole, and you can't do it regarding any particular practice of a specific culture either. According to cultural relativism, the different ways people have of living, they have no more gravitas than, do you prefer chocolate ice cream or vanilla ice cream? It's just that meaningless preference kind of idea rather than anything substantial. So, this is a new idea. You don't have to go too far into the past to find a time when we had very sharply contrasting views. When the British put themselves in charge of India, for example, they encountered the practice of sati, which is, when a man died, they would build a funeral pyre and then they'd throw the still living widow onto the fire as well. And the Indians, they defended that as customary, that this is part of their culture. And General Charles Napier, he responded, "Be it so. This burning of widows is your custom. Prepare the funeral pile. But my nation also has a custom. When men burn women alive, we hang them and confiscate all their property. My carpenters shall therefore erect gibbets on which to hang all concerned when the widow is consumed. So let us all act according to our national customs." And that's a very sharp contrast with multiculturalism, which says that all cultures, regardless of any kind of practices like that, have equal legitimacy. That in the cultural relativist perspective, only Indians would be allowed to judge sati, which they have as far as I know. They don't do that anymore. But the point was that it was never anybody else's place to say whether or not burning widows alive is wrong. Only Indians could judge that. And just like right now, it's considered hateful to speak out against a growing amount of, say, female genital mutilation or forced child marriage in the West. These are things that, well, it's just part of another culture. Who are you to judge? And if you say that's wrong, then you're violating cultural relativism and you are coming down on another culture. You're being anti-multicultural. And that's the thing about cultural diversity. It makes a certain amount of sense when you talk about the more subjective things, like what kind of clothing is proper for different occasions, or what's the best way to honor your elders, or the best way to show respect to one another, and so forth. There's lots of variability in those ideas between cultures, and that's fine. But multicultural relativism becomes fundamentally insane when it starts touching on the more objective matters of morality, like burning people alive. So that cultural relativism, it's highly flawed, but it is one of the key facilitators of multiculturalism. And the other big one that we hear a whole lot about is the celebration of diversity. Internal diversity in a specific society, in a specific jurisdiction, is portrayed as strength and beauty. It's a wholly positive thing. In terms of strength, the image we usually get is one where, everybody's different skills all create this kind of synergy when we come together as a team and we're able to solve all of our problems. In terms of beauty, you get that image of the mosaic, right? You have all these different individually colored tiles that are so different from one another, but when you put them all together, they form a beautiful image. So, you celebrate diversity, embrace difference. Differences are just the best thing ever. But that's the theory, that's the marketing, but that celebration only extends so far in practice. That's where things get a little bit messier. Ideological diversity, for example, is impossible under multiculturalism because no matter what else you might believe, everybody has to conform to the ideology of multiculturalism. Same thing with religions. Religious diversity can only include religions who see themselves as one valid option among many other options, and there are religions that see themselves that way. But religions like Christianity that make exclusive truth claims, well, they can't be celebrated. Not unless they adjust themselves so that they're less exclusive, so they don't make those same kind of claims, so that they are content to be simply one option among many. And some religions, like Christianity, simply don't work that way. If your religion is willing to teach that all religions are basically the same, then you can be part of that beautiful rainbow of diversity. Otherwise, you are a hateful bigot. Except for Muslims. Multiculturalists cut Islam a whole lot of slack because of their, basically it's because of the prejudice that Muslims are only like that because Christians were so mean to them, and it's kind of a defensive thing. And once you take the Christians away, then Islam truly will be a religion of peace. That's kind of the idea people have. Silly, ridiculously ahistorical, but, well, what are you going to do? But note the hypocrisy in all of this. Multicultural diversity, it's not actual diversity. The only religious diversity allowed is where there's an agreement on an ideology that's more important than the religion. In other words, there has to be an ideological God that is higher, that is more important to you than your supposed God that's part of your actual religion. And, that's an easy sell among theological liberals because for them, the details of the religion are always used primarily for inspiration rather than for truth or authority or anything like that. It's not so easy a sell when it comes to people who believe their religion's actually true. That's very different. So, in the end, multiculturalism hinges on this idea that deep down, everybody really wants the same thing as liberal multiculturalists. And if we have differences, well, you just need a little bit of education, maybe a little bit of liberation in order to just realize that everybody all just wants the same thing deep down inside. And again, you note the total absence of any real significant, meaningful diversity there. What multiculturalism does is it establishes a bunch of pageantry, essentially, around outward differences. What festivals do you celebrate? How do you dress? What kind of foods do you eat? And that kind of thing. But it always brings in ideological uniformity through the back door, or at least it tries to. And it has to, because it has no other way of dealing with the severe practical differences that come up when you force very different cultures to live in close proximity to one another. And if you want an example of this, just look at Europe today. Look at the way Europe is being torn apart over the whole migrant crisis. Because Middle Eastern Muslims, as it turns out, don't actually want to live the same way as liberal Frenchmen or as Germans. And so they end up setting up their own enclaves in these other nations that they govern themselves according to their own customs. You know, the infamous no-go zones that you hear about. So the entire point of multiculturalism is universality. But the migrant crisis is revealing that the presumed basis for that unity is not really universal. We don't all really want the same things deep down inside. The cultures actually do make a difference, a difference that's more important to most cultures than multiculturalism is. And multiculturalism usually goes hand in hand with another political ideology that we're going to talk about now, and that is globalism. Multiculturalism is all about multiple cultures within a single society. Globalism, it promotes the idea of a single global society that would encompass all of the world's different cultures. And so that's not identical with multiculturalism, but it dovetails very, very nicely with it, and they usually go hand in hand. After all, I mean, the entire world can be one society in which all sorts of different cultures can peacefully coexist, and all under the same banner. So, in other words, all humankind can be united as one, and nothing would be impossible for us. And there are three key ideas inherent in globalism. First is the idea that the national good has to be subject to the global good. That is, that nations should not be looking out for themselves or for their own people first. They should all be acting with the global interests in mind. Here in the United States, this usually manifests in terms of the U.S. either acting as a global policeman, getting involved in regional conflicts around the world where we have no real interest, and quite frankly, we have no real authority to be involved. These pushes to follow the UN, the global governing bodies and all things, even when it's bad for Americans because it's for the global good. And people often look at that impulse and say, well, it's just generosity. You're just putting others before yourself. That's how we're supposed to act. But the flip side of it is that all nations are ultimately seen as consumable resources for global interests, whatever that happens to mean. And global interest is one of those phrases, it's kind of like the will of the people, where it sounds nice, but in practice, it usually it's a stand-in for the will of the elites in whatever society you're talking about, whether national elites or global elites in the case of globalism. And very often, this turns out to be less about generosity than it is about one nation enriching itself at the expense of other nations. Or worse yet, the global power brokers enriching themselves at the expense of everyone else. The second key idea of globalism is free trade. People in one nation, they should be able to engage in commerce with people in another nation without any artificial restrictions. No tariffs, no trade policies that are imposed by one nation for their own benefit. Which, that's one of those things, sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. It really depends on the details of the trade. But it's often promoted, again, in that interest of peace, in that interest of getting along. If you've ever heard the phrase that, no two nations that both have McDonald's have ever gone to war. That's kind of the idea. That's false, by the way, that they've totally gone to war, but that's the idea. If we're close enough, we have no reason to fight. But more generally, nations with strong economic ties with one another would have a greater interest in avoiding war, is how people think. If you have a good, profitable relationship, then both sides have more to lose by disrupting that relationship through warfare. But again, that's one of those things that it makes sense superficially, but that's not actually the case in reality. The U.S. has fought wars with 6 of its top 10 trading partners. And the very fact that you are trading with another country, that does suggest some measure of shared interests. And when you have shared interests, you also have potential political conflicts because of those interests, if you don't want to share them the same way. So you have free trade, you have global good over the national good. And the last key idea is the free movement of peoples, and this is the really controversial one these days. That is to say that national borders are irrelevant when it comes to human migration. Borders, just lines on a map. They don't mean anything. And, whether you're an American or a German, etc., well, that just depends solely on where you're located at any given time. The blogger Vox Day, he aptly describes this as magic dirt theory. When a person migrates to another country, well, they'll just immediately conform to the new environment. All of a sudden, their culture, their blood, their heritage, their identity, all of those suddenly become completely meaningless to them the second they pass over a completely meaningless line on a map. So, yeah, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But the drive behind the idea is to be welcoming, to be compassionate to everyone. And again, to share the resources of richer nations with the people of poorer nations. So again, it has this guise, at least, of generosity. But again, it has that same kind of flip side as before, which is, it means that different people groups, different tribes, different nations, they're all fungible. They're all just replaceable parts. You can replace Swedes with Muslims. You can replace Americans and Mexicans. Makes no difference. People are just replaceable parts. You can get rid of the ones you don't like, put in the ones you prefer. Which is just not a very healthy way of looking at human beings. Because people get caught up with this because they think that what it means is that you care about strangers just as much as you care about your friends and your neighbors and your family and your countrymen. But again, that sounds good, but that's identical to saying that you don't care for your neighbors or your countrymen or your family or your friends any more than you do for strangers. Both of those statements functionally say exactly the same thing. They just have different connotations to them. And this free movement of peoples also it runs counter to democracy because it enables the people in power to replace their electorates. Again, that's supposed to work the other way around. The electorate's supposed to be able to replace their representatives, but if you bring in a whole bunch of people from a different culture, you can use that new voting block as a new voting block to change the people rather than the people changing the government. Because different peoples have different concerns, they have different prejudices, they have different customs and preferences. And all of those lead people to vote in different ways. And when it comes to America, at least, there are things like self-government or the right to bear arms that, globally speaking, those are fairly rare. And when you bring people in who have no history with those kinds of concepts, and they don't really place any value on them, they're going to end up voting against them. And when you bring them in on the kind of scale that we're seeing, they do so in election swinging numbers. It changes the entire political landscape. To try to shift this away from America for a second, by analogy, I'm sure the French wouldn't really appreciate it if 30 million Americans, suddenly migrated there, and they decided to start insisting on legalizing gun ownership in France. Again, not really a French value there. And if, when they said, when these American immigrants, they also said that, the French are upset with us for wanting to just have guns. And if we responded by, standing there with our barbecues on our front lawns and waving American flags and celebrating the 4th of July on Bastille Day, and we started telling them, oh, no, we are just as French as you guys. Yeah, I mean, that'd be ridiculously rude. I know it's a stereotype, but ridiculously rude. And in the same way, it's not wrong for Americans to be distressed about the tens of millions of people coming from countries like, say, Mexico, where, 2 of the 3 major political parties are members of Socialists International. The Democrats have to pretend they're not socialist in the United States, at least until recently they have. But again, the migration really changes that, which is great if you like socialism, but not so great if you're not a big fan of socialism. And don't get me wrong in all of this. People should treat their guests well, and nations should do the same. Nations should treat their guests well also. But the other side of that coin is that guests do have a corresponding obligation to remember that they're guests. and to act accordingly, not to try and take over the place. So when you add all of this together, in a way, you can think of globalism as this kind of neo-Babelism, where this is an attempt to overcome what God did at Babel by God divided the nations. Globalism wants to unite, again, just like at Babel, unite all of humanity together under that one banner, under that one king, so that nothing will be impossible for us, and we can solve any problem that we might come across, and not have any more warfare and world peace, and etc. Again, that same Star Trek utopia fantasy that we've had since the Enlightenment. And generally, all of this would have to center around a kind of institutional or ideological idol, much like the Tower of Babel was, something that transcends the gods of any nation and the religions and customs of any nation. So we have these two ideologies at work, and they're both hugely popular. I mean, I'm coming at this, of course, from a conservative perspective, but these ideologies are just as common on the right as on the left, or at least mostly as common. They just work themselves out a little bit differently. But these ideologies, they end up flowing out into our national policies as well. And again, mass immigration and illegal immigration would be the big examples today. When you look at post-1965 America and the immigration, both legal and illegal, it is the single largest migration in all of human history. It's huge, and it's by a wide margin. Exact numbers are difficult because of the whole illegality thing for a lot of it, but it is in the neighborhood of 60 to 100 million people. That's a lot. The next biggest are the post-World War II migrations out of Eastern Europe, which is about 15 to 20 million people, and the migrations between India and Pakistan after the British left, which was around 17 million people. So this is huge. But globalism and multiculturalism would say that the idea of having tens of millions of people from very, very different cultures living in your own country, it should not be considered problematic in any way. It should be looked at as a strength, as a form of beauty, as a form of opportunity. And what's more, it comes with the idea that Western nations have a moral obligation to ignore our own laws and disrespect our own borders, and ultimately to legally abolish our own borders as far as migration is concerned. And bring it back from the politics to the theology, more and more I am noticing this idea of a moral obligation for multiculturalism or globalism being supported by Christians, often by conservative Christians, as this kind of divine command, as though God's word commands us to adopt these ideologies. But is that really the case? Is that really what Pentecost means for Christians? And that is the question that we are finally going to answer next time. So please like, comment, subscribe, share, and join us for part 5, when we look at multiculturalism through the lens of Luther's Two Kingdoms theology.